session's not going to be no. This session's not going to be in detail technical. It's not meant to be. It's meant to just be an unpacked where we look at what came out 2 days ago and look at some of the detail of it and have a chat about it. I've got some slides because that's it's the easiest way for me to tell the story. Once we've gone through it, then we can have a bit of a chat and get some views and where else you think we need to take this. Also, if this session is of interest to you, and you think this would be useful in your with a tenant group or with staff or something, do let us know. But it's going to be an overview. It's going to be just to talk about what has been announced this week and the background to it. Give me a second on the slides while I just get them up because it always takes a minute and then we can get going on it. Switch it around. 2 seconds. There was a bit of a lag on.
Yeah, that looks good. Oh, I think you have to switch it around again.
So, welcome to this session, TPAS Cymru, the rent policy, and what does it mean for tenants and landlords? We'll take you through. People will just be joining as we go along. Quickly, I just want to take you back very quickly, the rent history for the people who are not familiar with rent policy in Wales. In Wales, the minister has traditionally set the overall rent policy and rules for social housing. I don't know how long that goes back, but in my 10 years here, I've seen 4 ministers come and go. And historically, it was set for 5 years, but there's been a lot of +1 year extensions and things like that. But generally, it was a 5-year cycle of rent. Typically, it's been set at CPI plus 1%, CPI plus 1.5%. CPI is a measure of inflation, if you're not familiar with it, and it's a consumer price index. So traditionally, over the last 10 years, it's been CPI plus 1, CPI plus 1.5%. One of the arguments for that, it wasn't an exact science, but one of the arguments in the past was for the plus bit was to pay for WHQS. So the low tenants were paying slightly above inflation. They were also getting better homes, more energy efficient, and better insulated and new bathrooms and stuff. However, tenants didn't really see it like that. And in sessions over and over, tenants saw the plus X% as a tenant tax to build more homes. The sector will disagree with that, but that's how it was seen. So that's rent history in 30 seconds. I hope that makes sense. So what's happening now? Well, there's been a Welsh Government a stakeholder review group been going for about 18 months now, looking at rent. There was lots of different subgroups looking at affordability, looking at also tenant engagement, a lot of different people involved in this for 18 months. And they explored options for rent, as you'd expect. And eventually Welsh Government consolidated all that thinking and thoughts that were out there and published their plans under a consultation in June, I think it was. Yep, 30th of June came out. So over the summer, we ran events. We ran a dedicated tenant pulse. Some of you might have come to that session. 550 tenants responded on that. And we responded to that, as did others. Everyone has their views on rents, whether that be landlords, local government association, finance people, things like that. So that's come together now. And what's happened is the minister now has published, Cabinet Secretary, sorry, their rent rules for the next period. We'll talk about that in a minute. So that's what's happened. I hope that makes sense. Before we continue, though, I don't know if it's going to be relevant or not where we look at it as we go on, but what about the other nations? What do they do? One thing that had a big influence, I think, that changed the course of the Welsh discussions was England came out quite early in this year with a CPI plus 1% for the next 10 years. And that had ramifications then for Wales, which I'll talk about in a minute. Scotland's a bit different. They don't have as many rules. Scotland rents, the landlord's got a bit more freedom. But with that freedom comes more transparency, much more transparency on comparing rents and seeing different things. And the tenants have a vote on the rent every 2 years. So they can actually decide on which rent levels and things like that. And Northern Ireland, well, if they were in a dating, it would be classed as it's complicated. They just do things a bit different there, and service charges are included, and water. It's complicated out there, so we're not going to even mention them, I don't think. But that gives a bit of context to where Wales sits, and that England bit did have a big influence, I feel, in where we're going now. So where are we? Well, the previous rent policy had expired. We needed in the sector, everyone needed a new one. And the landlords particularly were like, we need to know what's going on, because they need to know the rent rules for next April. And to be fair, they've got quite a lot of work to do. They need to model it, need to run numbers, set budgets for next year. There's paperwork, rent stuff that needs to be sent. And tenants under Rented Homes Act have got notice periods that they need to be told. So to be fair, we needed a rent policy. And social housing also relies on massive amounts of lending. It's what funds the refurbishment, funds WHS new builds, things like that. And the lenders needed to know what's going on in Wales, and what the plan is, and they need to have confidence in it. And we'll come back to that a bit later, if that's okay. But that's why we're here now, and why this week, certainly Welsh Gov were being in sections of the sector going, what's happening? We need to know. And it's about getting the right policy without being rushed, but also one that we can work with for the next period. So the first headline figure, the one that everyone always looks at, is what's called the rent envelope. And that is the limit, the rent increase a landlord can put it up. This is a pot, mind. There's variances we're going to talk about in a minute, but how much can a landlord put the rents up by to fund services, repairs, and things? The minister will always, in the paperwork, he'll always say, this is a limit. I've argued many times in the sector, it's a speed limit. We don't all have to drive at 70 if the speed limit's at 70, but there is more complicated things with how we're going to fund things. And therefore, it hasn't been a limit. It's been what everybody works to. Not everybody. And that's why in Scotland, you see much more variance, much more challenge not to hit the limits. But that is the rent envelope. It's what people want to know. And the decision was keeping their CPI plus 1% formula. Not a massive surprise to anybody. It's probably the good compromise position. The landlords would argue they need much more than that to do WHQS, to do the work, build more homes, things like that. Tenants are saying, come on, it's got to be affordable. They didn't want us, when we polled tenants, they were like, no, keep it at CPI plus nothing. And so it's that balance. I don't think anyone's surprised by that. The next bit was this 5 or 10 years. As I said earlier, generally we'd had 5-year settlements. And so Welsh Government asked the sector, what do you think about it? Should we have a 5 or a 10-year? And tenants in our poll, actually, at first sight, it said they were split between 5 and 10-year. Okay, well, don't mind. And it was pretty much like 49 and 2% unsure. However, when I looked at the detail and when we looked at the commentary in it, on it, the 10-yearers were actually saying, oh yeah, 10 years, but with a regular review, with a regular break clause. They weren't actually saying 10 years, if that makes sense. And so we reflected that in our reply back, saying actually feels like 5 years is more sensible based on some of the comments. And my personal view was, is 10 years is a long time. When we don't have an agreed affordability model, there's also new models emerging, new data points. We're putting sensors in homes. There's new ways we could have done this. However, the sector pressure was on. England had this 10-year deal, and that meant Wales was under pressure with finance, things like that. Landlords and bankers wanted that 10-year certainty. And to be fair, uncertainty creates risk. And when you're going to banks and loans and housing associations and councils use a lot of finance, risk creates more expensive debt. That reflects then in how much you can spend, how much tenant rent and things like that. And so a decision was made. The Cabinet Secretaries announced a 10-year deal. I can understand why. I don't think it's the right one personally, but that's what the sector needed for that stability. As I say, 10 years is a long time in this world of new data and machine learning and things like that. But we are where we are. The next one, and this was the next headline everyone always looks for, is this ministerial intervention if inflation is high. So there's always been a safety net of 3%, or not always, but as in modern policy, if inflation was over, CPI was over 3%, the minister could intervene and set what the maximum rent envelope cap, however you want to call it, is. They were there, the judge for this. And the tenant view on the ministerial cap was very, very clear. I've been involved in Pulse now for 7 years. I've never seen such unanimous feeling on the ministerial cap, which was, you can't touch this, right? The 3% was absolutely all age groups, different parts of Wales. Everyone was like, keep it, 3%. We value it. It feels like a safety net, feels like protection, so that and we trust with the minister to make the right decision type thing. The landlord view, there was a lot of them out there. A lot of people want to scrap it. Some of them, I spoke to somebody in Liverpool who was like, we put in like 6 or 7%, hoping to get 5 and things like that. There was a lot of pressure to raise that cap. One of the reasons was obviously 3% in modern inflation. We've had lots of high inflation over the last few years. So the minister's intervened a number of times now. So their argument was we need a more sensible approach. Tenants were like, no, 3%, we want to see that. So there was a lot for Welsh Government to consider on that. There was a lot of pressure on them. And so we've come with a sort of compromise, which is if CPI is under 3%, the cap, the CPI plus 1% remains. If it's between 3 and 5, then it's CPI plus 0.5%. And if it's over 5%, then the minister, cabinet secretary, whatever we call them this week, the minister can set that cap. So that makes sense. The practicality of that 3 to 5 does make sense, but it feels a little. But when I first read it, I was a bit like, oh, is this a slippery slope of slowly getting rid of it over time or raising it over time the next time round? As it stands, it probably is a right compromise and practical to stop lots of excessive work and doubt and things like that. I'm just worried that it's a start of something and raising that thing. And tenants very much didn't want to see that happen. So we'll see how this pans out. The flexibility, this is another subject that's always been quite interesting in some of the talks. So what it means by that is, it says, that's literally taken from the announcement 2 days ago, individual tenant rents can be reduced, frozen, rise by an additional £2.55 on the condition that it all adds up still to that CPI plus 1 or CPI plus half. It used to be £2, it's gone up to £2.55. That's quite a big jump. But then I don't know if that stays like that for the next 10 years or whether that's wasn't. I couldn't see anything that's had a review period in it for that. So whether they're factoring in, this is going to be a long-term thing. It's not quite clear. If you're not familiar with this, and this is meant to be for people who are new to this subject or and are not familiar with all the rent, this is an example. It's based on a real landlord conversation I had once just for lockdown, where they did some benchmarking affordability in their area, and I use it in quotes because but the 1-bed flats, they were more like bed sits, were actually in the affordability mark and the benchmarking and things like that were actually viewed as quite expensive, but just higher than they should be, and yet they looked and they thought the 5-bed houses were actually quite cheap. Again, I use inverted commas on that, but in their affordable mixes. So for that, they did some adjustments where some of those 5 beds and 4 beds, they were bigger properties, had more of a rise, and some of the one bed and the bed sits had barely any rise. Does that make sense? It's only an example. Don't get fixed on a 1 bed or 5 bed. There are lots of ways you can adjust rent within that landlord's affordability model to compensate. It could be based on location, it could be on property, it could be on, there's a lot of different factors, but that's an example of how really it worked. But again, I must stress, if you do vary that rent, it still must balance out and not exceed the overall envelope, we call it, of CPI plus 1% or whatever the cap is that year. Does that sound reasonable? Yeah, I was talking to somebody in TPAS this week about this subject in the office, and they were like, "It actually sounds quite reasonable. It makes rents fairer, adjusts stuff." I agree, but also, does it punish cheaper rents for legitimate reasons? It might be that area, actually, that property is really, hasn't had new kitchens, it hasn't had different things. It could be in a less desirable area. Are we punishing things that come out as cheaper? And in this example, this is a real one, again, seen before. It was a couple of years ago now. CPI was at 2%. That's why it says a couple of years ago. And the rent was below £100, which made it easier here for the example. You know, they actually would have been they'd be looking now at a 5.6% rent rise if you had CPI plus 1% plus £2.55, when CPI is only 2% and the wage rise was only 1% at that time. Because remember, jumping around here, but the CPI figure set now in September for the next April. In this example, this is a real example, by the time April came around, CPI was about 1%, and they were getting 1% pay rise, that tenants, yet they were faced with 5.6%. Now, the counter argument is, well, they had cheap rent, and so all we're doing is leveling up and things like that. It's not as simple as I think, and we have to be wary of who's getting these. You have to have a winner and a loser using this system. And again, I think that's part of that discussion we need to be having as to what's the policy and what impact it has on people. So it was £2 a week, this plus or minus. It's now £2.55. Hoping that's making sense so far. This next slide is the most complicated one. And Olivia and I were weighing up even to have this in here this morning. But I have to try and represent some of the arguments and some of the discussions that have been happening over the last 18 months. So there's an extra point on convergence. Bear with me on this one. Probably 90% of the audience don't need to know this, but I thought I'd put it in, which is through the working groups that happened, there was a lot of local authority representatives arguing they needed different levers or flexibility to catch up, as they were presenting evidence that some of the local authority rents were lower than housing associations. It's not equal everybody, not every local authority, not every housing association, but as a whole, they were like, if we're fixed to this model and we've got a lower rent, there's an issue with that, because I think we can all agree the cost of doing 10,000 homes to do HQS is the same. You can argue it's actually more for local authorities or stock transfers, but I won't go there. But we're saying that the bills are still the same. Bricklayers still cost the same. Windows still cost the same to be replaced and things like that. And they were arguing that if their rent is lower, and I've exaggerated these figures for the purpose of illustration, if their rent was £100 a week and a housing association's average rent £110 a week, that's a difference of 5.2 million a year. Yet they've still got the same 10,000 stock, there's still the same 10,000 things. And when you apply rent rises then, won't bore with all the figures, but actually the gap gets worse and it keeps compounding. Now, I may have lost most of you here, but I wanted to just represent that was something that it's not as simple as that. There are other factors. There's things called dowry payments and different things. But I just want to give you an overview of that issue, as I don't see the solution in the statement. I might be wrong, Maybe somebody comes on here in the chat later and goes, no, it's fixed. But I know that was something local authorities felt was needed, and I don't see the answer here at the moment. So what is missing? Anything else? Is there any elephant? The elephant in the room. So that was my thinking when I wrote that slide. The elephant in the room of what's missing is affordability model. What is affordable was that classic question I think everybody needs to ask themselves is, what is it? The statement by the CabSec says, as part of the rent setting, social landlords are required to assure themselves that the rent is affordable. There's no rule, there's no guidance, there's no model to, landlords have to assure themselves that it's affordable. And the Welsh Government will develop an affordability framework to sit alongside it in the future to inform rent and standards. I think that was it. And to support this work, landlords need to do assessments that will be collected annual. I'm going to come back to that. But this annual assessment where landlords got to talk about how they've assured themselves of affordability. And I think what became clear is throughout all these discussions, throughout everything, is we need a Welsh model. We really do, because everybody's got a different definition of what is affordability, what is affordable to, under different data and using different insight. It's great work on in Wales, in spots across Wales. I've seen some great stuff. I don't want to call names out, but I've seen some of the Meath Valley, United Welsh, Trefalis. There's some great work on affordability. We need a Welsh model because, and I think everybody agrees we need that. But my concern is, and the reason I put this slide in here is, how will we get there? Because this subject's not new. It's been kicking around 10 years. We've got good people in Welsh Gov who've been looking at this. They've already looked at it. They're good people employed to do this sort of stuff. We had a working group, and one of the subgroups was affordability and affordability models. I literally spent 18 months. We've got sector experts. What the Bevan Foundation don't know about poverty levels and affordability and JRF data and things like that. We have clever people. This has already happened, yet we didn't get an affordability model out of this 18 months and the working group and all the different insights. So how are we going to get one now? So the statement says we're committed to develop an affordability model. Good. I just wonder, what else do we need to know then? Well, who else do we need to involve? This makes sense. How are we going to get there? Because we've got good people already around the table and it didn't happen. So anything else quickly? I just quickly go over the no change bins, things like that. I'll try and skip over this. But there's a couple of things in there I wanted to mention. Service charges. The wording on transparency is a bit beefed up, a bit more. You need to make sure you engage. You need to be more transparent in service charges. But really, there's not much change to service charges. You've got to tell people about it. You've got to engage people. But I don't see anything that's really different in that. Welsh Government at one point did say they might do a separate piece of work on service charges. What they're saying is, there is no overall policy on service charges, just a bit beefed up. So no change there. The next one is in part 3 of the document. It talks about the jointly agreed initiatives. These are the sort of things that landlords have signed up to before, like no eviction in homelessness for financial hardship. Making sure financial support is available for those who need it. Tenant engagement on rents, and continue to improve homes, things like that. It's a lot of noble stuff, and that's good. But in terms of what we had before and now, I don't see any no change on it. Laudable stuff. There was one minor thing in there, which might interest some people around the table if you're involved in tenant satisfaction surveys and data, says working with the Welsh Government to consider up to 3 new questions over the rent settlement period. So at certain points in the year when you're doing tenant satisfaction surveys, the Welsh Government want to work with the sector to consider 3 new questions. So that might be of interest to some people here. The exemptions. Now, the exemptions are the types of houses that aren't included under the rent settlement. No big surprise, and many of them I don't disagree with. Student accommodation, that's a free market thing. Houses let, residential nursing homes, whole different sector. Social landlords, my own nursing homes, my own student accommodation, but rent settlement doesn't cover that. The one that I felt strongly and we wrote strongly about that was shared ownership. See it there. Shared ownership during the high inflation years got some really high rent rises, like 13% a year, because it was CPI plus 1, CPI plus 2 in their contracts. We argued strongly that that should have been, that the rent element from the social landlord should have been under there. I felt it was the right thing to do. We've raised questions in the Senedd before about it. No change, still in the exempt section. Another one the Welsh Government consulted on was about warm rents. And we've had discussions about this before. In Tenant Pulse, they were really against it on a simple sentence. Do you support this idea? Massive majority said no. What I would say is when you actually do it in workshops and you explain it properly and a bit more, you get a much warmer response to it. However, in the bin for the moment. It's part of the consultation, binned now for the moment. Another one was about when to set CPI. So I said already, it's based on September now for next April. And there was an argument that's really tight for landlords. You know, it's really tight in terms of all the things they've got to do and legally notice the tenant. Should it go back to the previous April? So that's almost 12 months difference between the start date and the CPI figure. Give landlords plenty of time. There's lots of reasons not to do it. In fact, there's lots and lots of reasons why it was a bad idea. The only good reason was it gave landlords a bit more time. Went in the bin. Nobody really liked the idea, and there's good reasons for keeping it like that. So sorry if you're involved in rent setting, you've got a really tight time scale still to do your work. Final point for a come off, and we get some discussion going. This I'd like you to be the judge of. I spotted something in here. I contacted Welsh Gov yesterday, I think it was, to clarify it, and I'd like your view on whether we think this is something that TPAS Cymru should push for, campaign for in the next round. So in Annex B, I won't bore you with it, but in this paperwork, it doesn't really come out, does it? No. There's something called Annex B, and to demonstrate compliance with the standard, there's an annual form that landlords have to fill in. And it's got some really interesting stuff in. They've got to explain the tenant engagement and consultation they've done and the methodology and the outcome and responses to that rent, how they've engaged tenants, how they've consulted, and what the outcomes of that rent consultations and engagement. They've got to demonstrate the affordability at the centre of their decision, how they've come up with it, provide assurances that they're, like if you're doing that plus or minuses, things like that, that their charges are not being putting tenants in hardship. Really interesting stuff. The options considered as well, how they came up with a different rationale for rent and service charge decisions. There's some boring bits in there as well in Annex B I don't care about. And assessment of cost efficiencies. Now, I was like, that's interesting. This is an annual form between landlords and Welsh Gov, but it's a treasure trove of information. It's a pot of gold for transparency, tenant accountability as to what your landlord's doing. How are they making it affordable? How are they engaging? How are they proving themselves that they are keeping rents affordable? That is a pot of gold to me. And I went, and as I said already, you know, tenant engagements, demonstrating affordability, the options considered. I think this is an assessment of cost efficiencies. So I mean, think about this, talking around in TPAS, talking, say, clarified stuff with Welsh Gov. This is a form that is between the landlord and Welsh Gov. Do you agree or not? I'd love to be part of the discussion after this. Landlords should publish the relevant parts as part of their commitment to transparency. You know, it doesn't have to be all the form. There's some boring bits in that form, and there's bits that I accept would be confidential and things like that. There's quite a lot in the form, but the nuggets of gold, the insight, the treasure chest stuff, I think should be published as part of their commitment to transparency. And Welsh Government should produce an annual summary of that best practice, so we can learn from each other. We can see who's doing interesting work and engagement on rent, interesting affordability models, things like that. It just feels like we need some more transparency. So I'd love to see your comments on that afterwards, once I come off these slides. So we're nearly there. I think, Olivia, you were going to mention this.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that we've got our conference in November, and we've got senior Welsh Government officials, so Rita Antonio from Welsh Government, who leads on rent. She'll be running a workshop session all about this in much more depth from that sort of expert perspective. I'll put a link in the chat to our conference webpage as well, and there's also a repeat of that on that day. Yeah. So even if you missed it, if that kind of time frame didn't work,
TPAS never repeat sessions at our conference, but this one we felt was so popular, we've asked for Rita to do a second session so that people can get to it in case of other sessions on at the same time. Yeah, good. Just quickly, I promised sector reaction. There wasn't a lot in this. I mean, it's only been 2 days, whatever. I was looking last night. The Pembrokeshire Herald faithfully cut and pasted the Welsh Government press release. Got on the Pembrokeshire Herald. There was a fascinating article by the British Landlords Association. I read it last night. How they analysed this and what it meant for private landlords. Absolutely no use to any of you, but actually well thought out, well crafted piece of work. And I think CHC put a statement on their LinkedIn, just I think supporting the 10-year plan, you know, the 10-year rent settlements, plan with confidence, questions remain about rent convergence, and yeah, looking forward to adjusted pace. So I think that was my run through for people to explain the rent. Let's have a chat. Let's talk about what your thoughts are. If there's any bits I failed to explain. I know there's lots of comments on the side. Hopefully Olivia might be helpful for me. I haven't seen any of them so far. Yeah, should we start on the side? Or I don't want to put anyone in pressure, but anybody who's come from CHC or Welsh Gov, if you do want to jump in or correct me on anything. I don't pretend it's meant to be the expert analysis, just to give you an overview of the rent. Olivia, is there anything on the side we want to pick up first?
There has been a comment from Louis saying, I'm not sure the 3 to 5% does make sense. CPI is at 2.9%, 3.9%, sorry, brackets results in a higher increase than CPI being between 3% and 3.3%. And then Vicky Miller's added on to that by saying, agree, this needs working on by Welsh Gov. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, very good point. Not something I'd thought of, and thank you for that. I also looked up whether it meant 3 point, is it 2.9 or is it 3.1? When is the 3 and the 5? It's not clear either on that, but I doubt we'll ever get 3.000 inflation or 5.000 inflation. Is always going to be above or below. But no, good point. Yeah, we'll take that and feed that back. I'm sure that's been picked up. Yeah. Rent policy. Sorry, does anyone want to say anything first? Let's just have some hands.
Don't be shy. Oh, Louise.
Louise.
Oh, I think I'm off mute. Yeah, I'm on video as well. Oh, yeah, I'm on video. Yeah. Thanks, David, for the presentation. That was really interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to, to make the point really that obviously we consulted over the summer, but we also, sorry, I'm from Welsh Government, just for anyone who doesn't know who I am. Yeah, so we consulted over the summer, but also there was extensive stakeholder engagement, prior to that. So everything that's in the policy is based on what people told us, either through the engagement or the consultation. And the immediate priority was just, providing that stability and certainty for landlords and for tenants. So, we have the CAB sector say in the written statement that, we've committed to additional work on things you've just mentioned, really, on affordability, service charges, rent convergence. There's lots of work to do. This is just the beginning, really. So just for everyone to be aware, and there'll be opportunities to engage in that work as we progress with it.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you, Louise.
Thanks for that. Josh, I think you had your hand next. So do you want to say who you're from? I know who you are, but oh, I've just lost him.
Yeah, we can't really hear you, Josh.
No.
Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, just about.
Okay, I don't know what's going on. Sometimes when I put my headphones in, it just doesn't let me speak. So I've taken myself off those now. But yeah, hi, I'm Josh. I'm from Community Housing Cymru. So and thanks for sharing that sort of reaction from us. But yeah, it's essentially I'm just going to be repeating that. It's like the top line at the moment really for us is that we welcome some elements of the policy, but there are some real challenges as well. I'm particularly concerned about that both work on affordability and convergence needs to happen at pace. But that's all I've got to say on that at the moment. But it's this is obviously very alive to some of the challenges still on this.
Yeah, and maybe that's what Louise was saying, isn't it? It's a start. Yeah. Louise, I don't know if do they call them legacy hands? I don't know if you're coming back, or we'll go to Lauren. Lauren, do you want to go? And if Louise
looks
come back, she can come back.
Yes, thank you, David and Olivia. And so I'm Lauren. I'm the policy manager over at Shelter Cymru. We weren't involved with the working group, but we submitted to the consultation. And one of our points from that will be going out in our statement later this week, just some concern about the definition of affordability and how that is conflating affordability for tenants with sustainability for landlords, and both of those things are incredibly important to this conversation. There is no part of us saying they're not, but we just are a little bit concerned about the trying to bring them together. It feels like maybe doesn't fully reflect perhaps Nye Bevan's view of a social home in that context. So yes,
no, I agree, and I think
coming through. But yeah, sorry,
that's what I was saying about the convergence stuff can often punish a property where someone's gone, well, actually our benchmark shows that that's a cheap one. That's,
yeah. And
the tenant won't see it like that.
But we have a good practice report that will be coming out later this month around the really good work that we know is happening with social landlords about working with tenants that are building rent arrears and kind of using data to be proactive and working in a person-centered way. So that we know that there's lots of good work already happening, but just a little bit of concern in that affordability definition in the standard.
Yeah. And those are definitely valid concerns, Lauren. So look forward to reading that when it's out as well. Anyone else? Anyone want to take themselves off mute?
Vicky, you've put a bit about the warm rents.
Yes.
Hasn't had any leverage.
Yeah, I think it's just common in the sector, isn't it? That obviously the challenge of decarb is that there's not really money to do it. So if you're investing in properties, I guess one way that you could afford to do it is by those properties paying slightly more because they're benefiting from the technology that's on their homes in terms of cheaper bills. But yeah, so disappointing in terms of from a housing sector perspective that you can't necessarily pay for some of the decarb works that way. So in the end, all tenants, especially, are then paying for those tenants that do benefit from it, aren't they, at the moment, whether you have it or you haven't. The balance in the books is quite challenging at the moment, so that some of the services perhaps you want to provide are going to be affected because of the push to undertake decarb works and comply with WHQS.
Yeah, and I agree, Vicky. I make no secret, when I've looked at this in detail, when we ran more detailed workshops, people get it a bit more, but as a headline figure, sometimes there's a trust level there with tenants going, I don't trust this, or I don't get it. And Pulse was quite unanimous being against it. But that goes back to us as a sector working better, explaining things better.
Some work to do, isn't it? So like the outcomes, so like where has it saved people lots of money? I think once seen that evidence, maybe it's a bit of an easier conversation to have. I think whilst things are still fairly new technology, there's perhaps some uncertainty, isn't there, still on the benefits that people see in their pocket. So hopefully over time that changes.
Yeah, and that's the difficulty I think I've got with the tenure policy. Is, I mean, thousands needed a tenure, but it's a long time to be locked in. Hello, if we're really blunt, we've got elections next year. We don't know where, what will come out of any of that. Any minister can change this deal. It would take a brave minister to change it so quickly, but a tenure policy is only as good as the next minister. Is there anybody to bring in here? I don't know if I explained the local authority dilemma at all to anybody, or whether I just confused everybody. I don't know if there's any local authority people here. But there is that catch up, I think it's not just local authorities. There's going to be differences in housing associations, all sorts of places. And can you really level up? Do you need to level up? Is one of the questions.
We've had something else in the chat, David. I don't know if you can see it, specifically relating to part 2, section 4 of the announcement. I don't know if you wanted to pick up on that point.
I'd have to quickly read it. Who posted it?
Louis Gittins.
Do you want to explain, rather than me trying to fill dead time reading it fast?
So I think what's been proposed does allow for convergence within the actual rent uplift itself. However, this particular section, whereby it refers to landlords having to remain within the rent envelope with all in-year lets as well, that kind of puts a constraint on landlords to be able to continue that convergence during the year. So say, for instance, a resident leaves a property and they're on a particularly low rent. If you're constrained by that overall rent envelope, you can't then actually increase their rent. So what it also creates is you'll have people moving into properties, and they could be picking up various rents dependent on what the rent was when the previous person left, which will result in a lot of unfair rents across areas. So you could have somebody moving in and their neighbour is paying significantly more because they've moved in with the old legislation in place. And then due to this, we're going to have people moving in on significantly lower rents, which has never been the case over the previous years. It's always kind of been increasing. So I kind of appreciate what the Welsh Government have tried to do on the most part with the actual rent uplift itself. But I think that particular section could create a lot of problems for that, because how do we explain that to residents? How do we justify that somebody's moving in next door to you in exactly the same property but paying significantly less rent than somebody who moved in last year?
I think you're right. I did have originally a slide about in-year lettings and new builds and stuff, and then I was like, oh god, this is going to get more complicated.
Because they've covered it with the new builds and advised that they can, because they're new builds, they can kind of be let under the affordable rent policy. So that they've covered that bit, but it's the relets that I think are going to cause some problems.
Well, I'm hoping Josh is scribbling down at this very moment as CHC. I don't know if there's any WLGA people on here that are invited, but I think it's something it needs to be fed back. We've got Welsh Government on the call listening. I would like to think in Wales, I think we do quite well at collaboration and talking. You'd like to see, is there amends or tweaks that can come out of this based on feedback? I certainly want to see whatever it was called, Annex B, more transparent. But that's because we're TPAS. I think you're raising very good points here, and let's see if there is scope for any tweaks or things as we go along.
Thank you.
Alan White, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what was the reaction? I know you're looking like, oh my god, what's he going to ask me now? What was the reaction of the CEOs, without giving any individuals, but just general? I know you probably have a chat, a group chat or something, don't you?
I would just say, I'm not a CEO, but I know that the reaction in general was that there are some, like, so I'm the rent and service charge manager for Heading, and I think I acknowledge that there's a benefit in some elements in that it does. I think it can help with convergence and bringing rents more in line and preventing them from, with the way affordable rent was, there was the potential that it just keeps growing and keeps growing, and then you never truly catch up. You never do get to converge rents. So I think there's elements of this, what's been suggested, what's been being implemented, that works to counteract that. But there are concerns around the in-year lets, because that'll have a significant impact on how we explain it to residents, but it'll also have a significant impact on income over future years, which will then drastically impact what we can do with our properties, especially with, you've got WHQS2 now as well. It's not, we've gone past WHQS.
And that was the point I was trying to make earlier, that the bill's still the same for everybody, isn't it? It's Windows
so I think that that's a concern, I think, for which is likely to be a concern for a lot of organisations, because although there's been some improvement in terms of convergence, I think that is a particular issue that could affect a lot of landlords.
Okay. So I don't know if Helen or whether Sam, Josh, sorry, whether there's, what was the from the other side, the landlord
I'm giving
side?
a personal view. I wouldn't, but I think I'd go back to what Lauren said around the fact that we genuinely want to find that right balance between being able to invest in our homes, but also ensure that our homes are affordable. And that is that's a tension, isn't it? And I think with an ongoing cost of living crisis, that kind of elastic band feels like it gets stretched. And then demands from Welsh Government around WHQS. But good landlords generally want to invest in our customers' homes so that they have great homes, because that's in our interest to do. That's what we're here for, to provide great services to our communities, to our tenants, and that's what we want to do. So one way of doing that is through maximising our rents, but we also know that puts the pressure on people's back pocket. So it feels like you're in this constant kind of stretched tension. I think for me, personal view, I think when inflation went really high last time, we missed the opportunity to have a root and branch kind of look at how we change policy. And this feels like a little bit of tinkering, but pretty much more of the same, which is, fine in some ways, in that it gives us that stability. But actually, I think there is a bigger conversation to be had about rent reform generally, that will absolutely need to engage tenants and all stakeholders, because we could fundamentally change how we set rents. So it's interesting times, and as you said before, with elections due next year, okay, you say we've got 10 years of certainty. I would be very surprised if this policy is in place in 10 years' time.
I agree. Yeah, we're in interesting times, and there's new data, there's new models. I remember beginning of that 18-month Welsh Government, with Emma Williams going, we better not spend 18 months and end up with CPI +1 at the end of it. And all this sort of ripple of joke, through the meeting was like, let's see where we end up, and we did. But it's something. Sam, hand up here.
I've got a really rhetorical question. So we've got Welsh Government here, we've got all these people from housing associations. How many of your wages went up by CPI?
I don't know if anyone wants to answer that. I don't know.
You could shake your heads, that's perfectly fine.
No, I think it's a really good question. I think our wages here are defined by the market rate for those wages. So I suppose you could say that social housing rents are, I know not everywhere, but generally below the market rent. So you could argue it the other way. But I think it's a really fair point, well made. So
because rents have gone up by CPI plus since I moved into my social house 4 or 5 years ago plus. And when you add that up, my rent has gone up by in excess of £130.
Yeah, do you know, Sam, it's a really important point. And I think, but the only thing I would, and again, not trying to make it okay or explain it, but if you think about the cost of delivering the services to maintain and improve your home, they've gone up by an incredible lot more than CPI plus 1%. Baked in inflation is running at around 17%. So the cost of delivering our services, but I know that doesn't make it any easier. But it's just to try. I don't want you to think we're like greedy landlords trying to just
I don't for 1 second think that you're greedy landlords. Please don't think that I think that you're exploiting me or in any way trying to sort of maximize profits, because I don't think you're doing that. But I think the problem, and this is more to Welsh Government, I think the problem is that the way that social landlords are funded is fundamentally flawed. Because by using CPI, which is a bad metric, because it's great for maximum, because part of the way that that's calculated is the cost of a flight. And people like me don't go on holiday. So the value of a flight to me is not relevant. So a lot of the metrics that you use to calculate CPI don't affect my life. How much bread affects my life. Now that's calculated because the shopping basket is relevant to me. But the fact that the price of that is all increasing also affects how difficult it is for me to pay my rent. As a disabled person with just one person in my house working, it makes it even more difficult. And unfortunately, my wife earns £30,000, so we can't get universal credit. Now, this is something you're all going to hear. You probably hear it every single day. So it's just, my point is you probably all don't get wage increases that are CPI plus 3%. And it's unfortunate that we are using metrics like that to increase our rent. And I think really genuinely with all of my heart that we need to look at if we can fund our metro system like that and expand our metro system, which is fantastic. I think we can probably help our social housing system in a better way. And that's literally all I wanted to say. But thank you for taking the time to listen to me.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Sam. That's a very excellent point.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to that affordability model that's needed over it. I understand Welsh Government needed to get something out, the sector needed it, but we need to go back to what is affordable. That's the fundamental. We've got the experts, we've got people who've thought about this for hours and hours, and I think we need to get around the table and try and work something out on that.
Yeah, and link it to that real life experience, which obviously Sam you've just shared. So yeah, that's really, really important.
I'm very conscious of time. I did promise 3/4 of an hour and we've gone over a bit. Did anybody agree or disagree with my thing about, if you can remember, where I was talking about that transparency of whatever it was called, Appendix B? No, I forgot what you call it now. But Annex B, you know, that transparency, I'd like to see that brought out, some of that data into open air and open discussion. So I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that. If not, we'll leave that for another day.
Yeah, we'll let you go.
Yeah. In which case, I think most people are looking like, come on, David, wrap this up. So thank you, everybody. I hope you found it useful. There's a recording of this. If you want us to do something with your tenants on this subject, I'm more than happy to.
Yeah, get in touch.
This is what we're here for. Olivia is our new policy lead here. We're keen to work with you on anything about rent. So get in touch. Thank you all for coming. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Take care. Thank you so much.
The slides you can have definitely.
And the recording. I'll send that out too.
Yeah, we'll send all that out.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Bye.